watching or listening to Film Club, and for the next 60 minutes maybe, we are going to be talking about Star Wars 4, 5, 6, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I am Matt.
I'm Ian.
And I'm Simon.
So Simon and I, along with Lee, did do this many years ago on the Blue Box podcast, but I think long enough time has passed, and presumably the listenership also has changed and or probably forgotten, that we can come back to this again. And of course Matt wasn't with us then, so he didn't get to do it, and Ian of course is a recent recruit, so he definitely didn't get to do this. So here we are back on the subject of Star Wars, and so this is the original trilogy episode, and I guess we'll do an episode on the prequel trilogy, and despite the fact that we've reviewed them all individually, we'll probably do the sequel trilogy as well. Matt, did you have something to...
As long as it means I don't have to watch Attack of the Clones again.
Well, this is I've suggested we do this as a film club without homework, where we don't necessarily have to rewatch, so we can just give our thoughts about what we thought then and how we how our feelings have changed and mutated, I guess, over the years. I mean, the question I often start with, and I think it's really pertinent now, is did you see this, when it first was released? When did you catch this, and what were your feelings about it then? I guess as the eldest, I probably should go first. I've told this story before. We queued twice around the block at the cinema in Sheffield at Christmas 1977. So we were up there for a week, which would have been from like Christmas Eve to New Year's Eve, I guess, or about
that's a long queue.
So I guess I saw this between Christmas and New Year in 1977. And as I recall, we were the last ones more or less in from the queue, and the people behind us had to wait another sort of 2.5 to 3 hours for the next showing. And this was in the middle of December, and this was in 1977, so it wasn't particularly pleasant, mainly because it was Sheffield, just up the road from the Crucible, unless I'm completely misremembering. Ooh. So that was when I first saw it when I was a kid. Obviously, I was absolutely blown away with it. Simon, I think you're the next oldest. Did you?
Early 78, I'm assuming. I don't think I caught it in 77. Early 78. My sister had gone to see it before me, which I was really annoyed about because she didn't show any kind of inclination to wanting to see it. She just happened to go, so I was really put out by that. Yeah, I went to see it in Bromley Cinema, I guess February, March 78, I guess. I don't remember queuing for that. I remember queuing, but not for that long. I know I queued longer the second time I saw it, which was on holiday in North Cornwall. But that was a few months later.
The December ones, though, they were literally queuing around the block because it had been out in America for 6 or 7 months. So the promotion, the hype, word of mouth, despite the fact you didn't have any internet then, word of mouth was just like off the scale for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Ian, you can't be old enough, surely, for... No,
I was trying to think, which was why I was pulling those extraordinary faces during your bits. I
thought you just had an extraordinary face.
I thought it was constipation.
Yes, thank you. I think I probably would have seen it on television maybe in 81, maybe. I don't know when it first got shown on.
It was later than that, wasn't it? It was on...
I would have thought
it took years to come on TV, I think.
The standard for films to come to television back in the sort of 70s and 80s was 3 years, but big blockbusters would generally tend to be 5 or 7. So it could have been like 80. It might even have been after Return of the Jedi. Do you remember if you saw it before Return of the Jedi was in the pictures?
I had seen I'd seen Star Wars. I hadn't seen Empire. I didn't see Empire until after Return of the Jedi. Jedi being the first one that I saw in the cinema.
There you go. It's perhaps 5 years.
I've just I remember there being a really cool cover for the TV Times. It was 1982. It was shown on TV.
Okay, maybe I saw it then. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense because they showed it on telly basically in the run-up to Return of the Jedi and the end of the trilogy. So that would have given people even more reason to catch it on the telly. And when you saw it, do you remember? Because I mean, for me and Simon, we saw it while there was still a lot of hype about it being in the pictures. You saw it after Empire Strikes Back had been around, and so do you remember whether there was much anticipation?
I think at the time I would have seen it. I think my generation were wholly obsessed with getting the toys and getting all the figures, and I think the actual original films were just this kind of slightly annoying text that we were required to watch at some point to know what we were supposed to do with these amazing toys, figures, and spaceships. Yeah, it was kind of a, I don't want to say it was like a religious thing, but it was there was a weight on you to make sure you go and see these things, because these are the most important things that have ever happened. Rather than being perhaps the most engaging or charming or alluring, they were there, and they had to be seen.
Fair enough. And Matt, I'm guessing you were too young for Star Wars at the pictures too, obviously. Do you remember when you first saw it?
No, but it must have been television, because I remember the trash compactor scene scaring me. So I definitely saw it quite early on to want the toys, but not really understand what the toys are for. I really like the stormtroopers. I wanted to be a stormtrooper, which suggests I was too young to understand the goodies and the baddies in it. So I reckon I probably watched it on telly in 1980, whatever, and then gradually watched the other two films as they came. I remember them. I remember Return of the Jedi quite clearly, but again, it must have been from telly. But again, like Ian, it was about the toys, I think, and about collecting the toys, and I got pocket money for Princess Leia or something. I went out to town and bought Princess Leia with my pocket money.
Yeah.
So what?
Great days.
Yeah.
Oh, and the Ewok, the two Ewok movies I must have seen. I watched with exactly the same weight as I watched Star Wars when I was younger. I remember watching the Caravan of Courage around a friend's birthday, and it was just as exciting as watching Return of the Jedi. I didn't see any difference in weight or import between the two movies.
I went to the cinema to see that, and I just thought, where are all the special effects? There are no special effects. I think there's one laser blast or something I seem to remember.
Oh, but nothing in space either, I guess, of course, in there. I've not seen either of them. So they're a bit. There's
some stop motion animation in the second one, isn't there? I think.
Fair enough.
I mean, I remember a really creepy sort of underwater being trapped scene that scared me at the time as much as The Omen 2 scared me, with the trapped under the ice bit. Oof.
Which also you were watching at the age of 6.
Yes, yeah, obviously. I was precocious.
Right, let's talk about whether the first Star Wars movie and, well, I was going to say let's talk about whether it's any good. Let's talk about what it's called. I'm going by the despecialized edition, so for me it's still just Star Wars. And of course, when I saw the pictures, it was just Star Wars. And so this renaming it A New Hope, I mean, it's all very well to rename it so it fits in along with the rest of the saga. They could have thought of a slightly more exciting title for it, couldn't they?
Well, George Lucas's history of thinking of good titles is sketchy at best. Do we know when it first materialized under the name of Episode 4 A New Hope?
I was a member of the Star Wars fan club after Empire, and I seem to remember reading it in Bantha Tracks, which was the newsletter that got sent from America. It was really exciting because it had an American stamp on it, and I seem to remember it was in there. So it was between Empire and Return of the Jedi.
Surely A New Hope is retrofitted because it was the capital letters on the top of the scroll, which presumably that scroll was in the original, so the capital letters were on the original. It's only Empire Strikes Back where the capital letters become the film's title. So it's it's a bit like, well, now with from Empire Strikes Back onwards, the capital letters on the scrolling.
You mean like the?
I don't think it did say A New
It
Hope.
didn't have them.
I
No,
don't
I don't think it
no.
did.
Did it not?
No.
How did it start?
It just started with the scroll without the capitals at the top.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just a scroll for itself.
It's a shit title then, isn't it? A New Hope. A New Hope. They could have called it.
Is it
Rise
the
of-
shit
It would have been a flop, wouldn't it,
Rise
if
of
they'd
the
have called it
Rebellion
that?
or something? But no, they call it A New Hope. So there we go.
Captain Corellian's mandolin.
Very good.
I wonder.
Captain Corellian's Mandalorian is what they are.
Oh,
Actually.
nice one. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
That's even better, yeah.
I wonder if actually it got that title just before Empire Strikes Back came out. At the time, of course, because we've talked about the fact that it took 5 years then for it to come to telly. And in those 5 years, because back in those days, films, when there was no DVD and no streaming and nothing else, films would often appear in the pictures several times over, especially really successful ones. So something like Star Wars, Jaws, whatever, the Godfather movies, you sometimes find them popping up, 6 months after the original run, they'd come back for another run. And Star Wars, when it came back for another run before Empire Strikes Back, I remember it being quite heavily promoted. Here's another chance to catch Star Wars before the sequel comes out. I wonder if that's when they took the opportunity to give it the title, because with the second film coming, then you could set up the fact that it was a series. Because I'm pretty sure I remember George Lucas already at this point talking about the idea that it would be a trilogy of trilogies, because it's before even Empire Strikes Back comes out, the toys are already taken off, and it's become apparent that this is a massively successful movie, and there's scope to do a lot more.
Just looked it up. It was 1981. The title sequence was changed. So it was post
there you go.
Empire.
You were right in the first place. And that
Stalinist revision of history.
So what do we think of it as a film then? I mean, because we saw it as kids, and when you're kids, you're sort of qualitative, sort of, you're not so aware of how good things are so much as how they excite you. So it excited us as kids. Does it still excite us as adults? Does it still work as a grown-up? And before we get Matt to talk about Kurosawa, let's just talk about and before Simon starts talking about the golden story or whatever it is he's gonna, I can't remember what it's called, you'll bring it up, Simon.
Hero's Journey.
Hero's Journey, yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. Let's just talk about, does it work as a movie? Because I think one of the things I think about it is it's quite cheesy, but it gets away with it because it's got a self-contained story, and it's kind of quite archetypal. I think when Lucas tries to tease out the archetypes in Empire and Return of the Jedi, it's just slightly diminishing returns, because I find the characters more difficult to believe in as human beings because I think the thing with the sequels is, when you get to sequels, you have to imagine their life away from the screen, because you have to imagine that time has elapsed between one movie and the next. Whereas in a self-contained story, you don't have to imagine them as characters off the screen. And I think slightly there's a kind of diminishing return effect with the sequels, because I don't think the characters are that believable. But in terms of the first one, I think, for me, I think it works really, really well, because it has that same level of cheese throughout. And we hadn't seen that level of cheese since something like, I guess, Flash Gordon, and maybe in the movies in the 50s, but the movies in the 50s were very definitely mostly based around Earth invasions. So they had a very different sort of slant to them. So Star Wars felt like something really unique and original, despite the fact that it was kind of cheesy and cliched, and it had packaged the cheese and the cliches in this manner that we'd not seen them before, that made them feel like they were real rather than just cheesy. I don't know, Ian, what do you think of the first Star Wars as a movie?
I'm kind of conscious that I still can't look at it objectively, because it is just the defining shibboleth of my life. But I remember reading that George Lucas had kind of based his script on the kind of RKO cliffhanger serials of the 40s. So, you know, Flash Gordon, King of the Rocket Men, Undersea Kingdom, all those classics. And, you know, without having watched it for probably almost 11 months, maybe something like that, it feels so expertly plotted and structured. You know, there's a moment of excitement every, 5-6 minutes. That doesn't happen by accident. You know, the years he spent tinkering with those ideas in his head really created something that, you know, if you're the right age when you watch it, or, you know, if you're into that sort of thing, you are catapulted through the 2 hours of the film, you know, breathlessly. I just think it's structurally incredible to keep lurching from one set piece to the next without letting up. I think it's structurally astonishing.
And I think, and maybe this is part of the legacy of THX as well, in a way. There are things in there, and Matt mentioned the trash compactor, right? There are things in there where Lucas has clearly thought about the world around him, the real world around him, and sort of transposed that into a science fiction setting, which gives it this sort of undercurrent of reality that makes the sort of fantasy elements and the ridiculous elements over the top seem more believable. So like the weapon of mass destruction is, you know, he's making this film 20 years after Hiroshima, the weapon of mass, 30 years, sorry, after Hiroshima. But he's in that generation for whom that's either a childhood memory or something that his parents would have spoken about. It's something that looms large over American history during his childhood. These are things that he's put in his movie. Simon, tell me about the hero's journey.
My understanding, or the story is, another story, is that George Lucas was trying to write Star Wars for a long, long time and trying to get things right. And I think originally Ben Kenobi was going to be the central character. Han Solo was a big green monster. You know, and he's trying to find these roles and trying to work out how to create this modern day kind of legend, or I suppose create his own religion in some respects, something that people can aspire to, and to give them positivity.
Like George R.R. Martin did with Lord of the Rings, right?
Yeah, certainly. And the book he discovered, or he read about, was a book called The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, which essentially goes through, and it's much like one of these books where they look at story shape and ongoing themes which have echoed right the way through history, right the way through pre-Christianity, right the way through this idea of this hero who doesn't know he's a hero, but he has a challenge put in front of him that he either has a choice, he either takes the challenge or he decides against it. But usually events take the power out of his hands, and he's got to find his own way, and you know, ends up rising to the challenge and becoming the hero. And you'll see that there are ways of applying this template to various different ways all the way through history. And the strange thing is this is never consciously done until recently, obviously. You know, it's obviously something which is deep in the psyche of human beings, of our, I don't know what you call it, whether it's down to our morality or our sensitivity towards stories and storytelling. So yes, and that's essentially how George Lucas got his story shape, and how Luke Skywalker was born, or Luke Starkiller as he was originally.
And of course, it's about overcoming the odds, but overcoming the odds is not just about overcoming the odds. It's about having a goal, about having something that needs to be achieved. And, you know, a lot of storytelling comes out of that, but that's the story of the human race. Everything that we've done, from inventing a machine that slices bread to sort of inventing a wheel and the combustion engine, is all about having something that you need to figure out how you can overcome a problem that you've faced, that you've discovered, that you've realized exists, and, you know, overcoming that. And stories like Star Wars really are kind of, in a way, they're sort of a metaphorical version of that sort of process. But Matt,
and there's also and just very briefly, there's also the thing of the son and the father as well.
Oh yeah,
which is always there. So yeah,
which comes in later on, of course. Spoilers. Matt, tell me about Kurosawa and the robots.
No, Star Wars. I think, oddly for a film that sort of pushes the technological boundaries of what was possible at the time, I think it's the limitations that George Lucas found that makes the film so successful. Because as Simon was saying, George Lucas's original treatment was ridiculously. If they'd done that, it would have been Flash Gordon. It would have been this ridiculous film that was unbelievable in parts. But because he had to pare it down just to the point where they almost couldn't do it, but then bust a gut to do it, I think that's what makes it successful. I think I agree that I agree it's really well structured. I can't watch it these days because I get bored by the Tatooine scenes. I just want them to go off into space or to go onto the Death Star, or the Star Destroyer. I can't help but find the Tatooine scenes slightly dull because it's just sand. But what I am interested in is the making of films. I find the making of Star Wars far more interesting than Star Wars itself. The kind of, again, heroic endeavors of the special effects team developing their own cameras and their own rigs, the kind of the almost sort of suicidal efforts of George Lucas, who nearly kills himself with stress when faced with these actors who aren't really taking it seriously but somehow managing to turn out performances. The editing, which I think makes, by what I've seen, makes the film. So George Lucas turns in what is in effect a scrappy film, and then it's rescued by his special effects team and his editors and the musician John Williams, who sort of all pull together to just pull this film out of the fire in spectacular fashion. And I grew up, like Ian, I grew up with it, so it's hard to be objective about it. All I can say is I haven't managed to sit through it in 15 years.
Oh.
Unlike its sequels.
Given that Tatooine has gone on to be the most important planet in the entire expanded universe and everything visits Tatooine, surely that should be the most important part of the text.
Yes, but my heart sinks whenever they revisit Tatooine. The Boba Fett series to start with was like my nemesis.
But when they returned to it in Return of the Jedi, that's quite a special thing, I think. When they go back there, it's like, oh, the hero has returned, and now he's somebody now.
That's true. I did find the Tatooine bits in Return of the Jedi more acceptable, but the horror of the big sand mouth. I mean, that did something with sand that I found quite exciting.
Okay, two things then. The Kurosawa, the reason I brought it up is because, is it Hidden Fortress that starts with the two side characters? Yeah. And we see Hidden...
Lucas went to film school and he watched a lot of films. So Spielberg, Lucas, obsessed with Truffaut and Kurosawa.
But the reason I bring it up is because Lucas, as I was saying before, Lucas takes things from the world around him and reinvents them through science fiction. And I think one of the genius ideas of Star Wars is taking these two side characters. John Milius does it again in Rome, of course, where Rome is seen through the eyes of two centurions. He takes the idea of having two side characters through whose eyes you see the events of the movie and reinvents them as robots. And that's a little bit of genius, because sort of the first 10 minutes of Star Wars, more or less, you just see everything through the eyes of these robots. And they're so well characterized that they're charming and engaging and funny and recognizable. Sorry?
Tedious. That's the bit that I struggle to get through at times.
Well, now you might, but I don't think that's true for everybody sitting here, and I don't think that's true for the audience as a whole.
I don't for 1 minute think that Star Wars can't survive, and people's fondness for Star Wars can't survive me disliking the two droids. in it.
Well, yes,
and
but you're underlining the point I'm trying to
for
make.
them has been sort of compiled by their cameo appearances in films since, culminating for me with Attack of the Clones, where they become like animated chaplains from modern times going through the machinery. But Star Wars is a great film. I just haven't managed to sit through it in 15 years.
I think when you're a kid, you kind of don't really notice R2-D2 and C-3PO because they're a sort of tedious bit of fluff before the next exciting bit with Darth Vader.
No, that's not true. They're the robots. They're really exciting when you're a kid, surely. I was excited by them.
Okay, anyone else excited by them when we were kids?
I still get a huge thrill just the image of them standing in the desert.
Okay.
My little
boy
is just something weird by them.
Just I'm 7 years old again. It's just weird.
I just think of Anthony Daniels with his underpants slowly soaking with sweat.
And being a complete bastard to Kenny Baker.
Yeah, that's all.
Maybe that's it. Maybe I've seen too much behind the scenes documentaries. But
droid sleeve.
But the reason I brought it up is I think it's a bit of genius from George Lucas to reinvent those characters as robots, which completely turns something that should be familiar and ordinary and quite prosaic on its head and makes it, whatever you think of the guys who play them and the characters that they play, it makes something really exotic and alien out of it. So it turns this film, especially for kids, into this most exciting thing because you're spending all this time in the company of these two characters who are just alien and weird and different, and it's exciting and slightly unnerving at the same time because it's so different from what you're used to. I just think for a kid, that first sort of 15 minutes is kind of magical. But the other thing I was going to bring up is, and this is kind of the antithesis of that, is that, and I kind of alluded to this before anyway, Lucas comes through at the same time as Scorsese and De Palma and Spielberg and all the others. And these are the film brats, the ones who've been brought up on cinema. And so they're making, because earlier generations of cinema makers had been brought up on theatre, and then they'd been brought up on the silence, and they had different influences. But the film brats have been brought up on cinema and now television. And so that gives them a different influence for the way they make things. And one of the things, the sort of innovations, not really an innovation, but kind of, that's the word I'm going to go with, that the film brats had in the early 70s was to make cinema more realistic. So you had method at the end of the 50s and in the 60s, and the film brats took filmmaking methods, lighter weight film cameras, better film editing techniques, and the idea of actors doing method and realism, and kitchen sink, of course, had also been a thing. And then you had the Beatles and the counterculture and everything else, and there was this big melting pot of all these things. And then in the 70s you got films like Mean Streets, and you got films, you know, like Jaws, which is sort of like this, it's kind of a fantasy, but you sit down and watch Jaws and it feels like this really gritty drama about a giant shark terrorizing people on this island. But there's this really weird counterpoint between the fantastical elements and the really down-to-earth humanizing elements. The scene in Jaws where Roy Scheider sits there with his kid and the kid's copying his actions, you cannot imagine a movie made before 1972, 1973 having anything like that scene in it, because that's just not something that a filmmaker would think to commit to celluloid. And what I'm coming to is, and George Lucas takes all of this and then he makes something that resembles these 1940s serials, Flash Gordon and the like, but he makes it with that weight of the change in filmmaking techniques that comes in the 1970s, and the result is Star Wars that's a million miles away from the Flash Gordon serials while being exactly the same as them at the same time. And I think that, again, I think it just arrived at a juncture in cinema making that you'd never get again. So you're not going to get another movie that has the impact that Star Wars does, because you're not going to get that sort of confluence of, I mean, you've had things like, you know, when we went over to digital, but then the result of when we go over to digital is the Phantom Menace. So Star Wars just arrives at a confluence in cinema that I think is unique, and that Star Wars benefits from beyond what any other movie ever really has, from that kind of confluence of events. Any thoughts, or shall we move on to Empire Strikes Back, Ian?
It's a weird thought to analyse, because obviously George Lucas was kind of Francis Ford Coppola's bitch come office boy for a good 4 or 5 years before he made his breakthrough. And I hear what you're saying, but George Lucas is empirically not a good director. So whatever.
No, but that's what I mean. That's kind of my point. Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever rubbed off on him for the first film immediately fell away. And you look at the Phantom Menace and the other ones. But yeah, there was a kind of a grandeur about the framing of the first Star Wars, and I guess the sets and the locations were. Like you were saying, they didn't feel like 1940s sci-fi sets. They felt real.
There's something mad about the ambition of it, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, Star Wars is kind of Lucas's Apocalypse Now in a way, isn't it? It's go off and have this mad idea and just find the money and do it, and go to places like Tunisia to get it done. It's insane, really.
And there's in a way that's a reaction against New Hollywood. So people like Spielberg and Lucas, they're not really in this generation of New Hollywood. They're kind of coming in later. This is sort of new Hollywood where they're reacting against it, and they're almost going back to sort of David Lean territory.
Old Hollywood.
They are going back to old Hollywood, but with bits of New Hollywood, because they've been taught by the kind of New Hollywood cohort.
But this is kind of the point, isn't it? Whatever you want to do, whatever you think you're doing, you're actually influenced by what's going on around you, whether you like it or not. And so Star Wars is influenced by Mean Streets as much as it is the Hidden Fortress in some ways.
Yeah, but I think after Star Wars, then it becomes much more commercial. So then we start getting into 1980s sequel territory, which, there's no way that,
That's why I'm saying that Star Wars is kind of the fulcrum of all this, and before and after things are different, and it just lands in 1977 at the perfect point.
One thing I was going to say is I've realised through the years reading various books and kind of understanding, in the same way as Matt's been saying about as you grow up, the process of its creation becomes as exciting as the film it was itself, is that, as you say, George Lucas was reacting. He was in a situation where he was slightly out of control and finding the whole process incredibly stressful, but trying to get the stuff in the can under extreme circumstances like the weather. The sets got destroyed in Tunisia, so they were trying to rebuild it. And you had Harrison Ford reacting to the script and chucking his own bits in, which essentially made Han Solo. And then you've got he's then offloading his stress onto the effects team by saying we need this in so much time with so much money, and therefore they start inventing these new processes. And then you've got Paul Hirsch coming in to edit the thing together because this is an absolute mess, and it creates that velocity that you were talking about, Matt, I think, of where it goes cut to the next bit, cut to the next bit, cut to the next bit, and it works, and the whole thing works, and it's a happy accident. And it's brilliant because, if it hadn't been for George Lucas thinking of this idea of this used universe, that's a massive thing for it. The idea of using the merchandising to suck money out of the process, and that becomes a thing in itself. And all these things happen, and it could so easily have not worked, and it did. And it's the following. He didn't direct the next two films because he found it so stressful, so he takes a back step and lets somebody else do it.
Does he?
Sorry?
Doesn't write them either, does he?
I think he writes the basic story, doesn't he? And then that essentially gets Lawrence Kasdan and but then other people take on the mantle, and they're able to analyze Star Wars and say, right, what are the best bits we're going to take on. But then he comes back for the Phantom Menace, and suddenly through this new technology, he's got control, and we suddenly see the sort of film that Star Wars would have been if he'd had complete control. And I just don't think if George Lucas had that control, we'd be having this conversation now.
Yeah, but
that's not taking away his genius of coming up with the idea in the first place. But like you were saying, as a director,
I think George Lucas thought he was an auteur to start with. Star Wars demonstrated to him that he wasn't an auteur, because actually everybody else around him kind of rescues the film. And after Star Wars, he becomes not a kind of a film director. He becomes a producer, a sort of mogul, and a film studio head. And that's kind of the best place, because that's what the prequels demonstrate, is his best place is dealing with the money and occasionally saying to Steven Spielberg, I now like this Indiana Jones script. We can do this.
Yeah. Let's talk about Empire Strikes Back then. So I saw this at the pictures clearly. I remember also when the edition of Starburst magazine that had the review in from John Brosnan, who was quite a well-known figure in those circles at the time, and he slated it. And I remember the reaction to that was people were shocked, because then when people went to Empire Strikes Back and all these people were just a few years older than they had been when they'd been at the pictures watching Star Wars, they thought it was the best thing they'd ever seen. Now, I'm not here to slate Empire Strikes Back, but I kind of get where John Brosnan was coming from, and I'll probably go into that in a minute. But at the age of, what would I have been, 12, Empire Strikes Back was the best thing ever. It was the Star Wars sequel that a 12-year-old wanted to see. Not so much a 54-year-old, but we'll get back to that. Simon, you saw this at the pictures, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was it the sequel you wanted to see?
Oh, totally. And by this point, I was so obsessed and so invested that I was there with those characters going through what they were going through. I mean, when Han Solo was frozen in carbonite, I was devastated, and it was almost like watching a horror film. That, oh my God, how can they do that to him? He's the hero. Sod Luke Skywalker. Han Solo's the hero. How can they do this to him? Are they going to bring him back? Is he going to survive? So emotionally, it was incredibly impactful, and it did feel like you kind of grew up a little bit after that. And I think that's why it had the effect it did, because it did feel like that little. I mean, we've just watched Andor, and in my 50s, I feel like I'm finally growing up. Star Wars is growing up, but now I think about Empire Strikes Back was Star Wars growing up, because suddenly these perfect heroes who couldn't get shot by stormtroopers were getting the crap beaten out of them, and that became quite a thing, really. And suddenly you're seeing far more of this world. It's hard. It's really hard to describe, really, but I think that original film became such a bubble of perfection in your head that when Empire Strikes Back came along, that bubble was exploded, and suddenly the possibilities were endless of what could happen within the Star Wars universe.
But that's the key, isn't it? So that it suddenly becomes a Star Wars universe rather than a single film. That's the exciting thing about Empire Strikes Back for me, is you start to see where this story can be expanded. You start to see proper hints of a world around these characters in a slightly deeper universe. And I have watched Empire Strikes Back happily in the last 15 years multiple times, and I think that's because I just find it more exciting, more interesting. It does more things, it says more things.
And Ian, you saw this at the pictures, you say?
No, I didn't see this
Return of the Jedi was the first one you saw.
I didn't see this one until after I'd seen Jedi, but somehow I learned what happened in the film, probably from comics or talking in the playground or whatever. When I finally did see it, it was instantly my favourite, and it remains my favourite. I was there for Vader. I loved it when he, handed Luke his arse. And I think it marks the moment in where the Star Wars thing kind of became a trilogy of movies that starred Harrison Ford. And I think even though Han Solo was perhaps not the preeminent character in the first film, I think this marks the point where Han Solo basically becomes as important as Luke. And yeah, it's the expanded universe. Suddenly there's an ice planet. Suddenly there's a horrible swampy planet. Suddenly there's the rather bland Cloud City, which fortunately 20 years later we got to see a city in the clouds. Otherwise it was just some corridors. It could have been from season 17 of Doctor Who, couldn't it? But yeah, and what an ending. What a massive punch in the stomach as, the Empire kind of clean up. It was brilliant. It was just what was needed, and we just needed 1 or 7 more films like that. Oh.
See, for me, I'll get this out of the way quick. I think it's the bit where Star Wars starts to become really formatted. And so we'll start on this planet, and then we'll have a detour to this planet, and then we'll end on this planet, and the story will follow this. And between Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, I just feel like I'm seeing the same story 3 times. Or maybe twice, because Empire Strikes Back finishes on a kind of, for me, really unfulfilling note. And then the other thing is, as I kind of suggested earlier, I don't feel the characters are strong enough to withstand the expansion. So for me, I loved Empire Strikes Back when I was 12, and at the age of 54, I think it's probably the least satisfying of the original 3 movies, and it's very much weighted towards the beginning. It's a bit like Mad Max in the extent that if you've seen the first 15 minutes, you don't actually need to see the rest of it, or at least in terms of if you're after the exciting stuff, you don't, because actually I think Mad Max is a better movie once you've got the exciting stuff out of the way. But I think Empire Strikes Back is top loaded, and I find it just kind of there's a big downhill sort of thing across the last hour, and I think some of it's pretty boring actually, both on Dagobah and on Cloud City.
I think it goes the other way. I respond more to the stuff in Cloud City and the betrayal and what happens to Han Solo. I'm more excited by that than I am about a big fight in the snow and then a Muppet in a swamp.
I mean, I like the snow bit, but I'm with Simon and Ian that Han Solo being frozen in carbonite is an extraordinary scene.
I can remember being a kid and lying there pretending I was frozen in carbonite.
I think it's amazing. Yeah. Really well done.
Yeah.
See, it's never worked for me.
Again, really well edited. Really good with sort of additional dialogue from Harrison Ford. The sets are really good,
Well, of course, Lawrence Kasdan's responsible for the dialogue now, and all of a sudden you get this great big. See, where the first Star Wars is, the dialogue is kind of Flash Gordon style dialogue. In Empire Strikes Back, you get this big infusion of sort of screwball comedy dialogue, and so all the scenes between Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher are straight out of like Bringing Up Baby or whatever, and it could be Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn or somebody, and see, for me, again, it comes back to the idea of these are not the characters from the first movie anymore. And so as a kid, I loved it, but those bits even then stuck out as a kid. And now as a grown up, I think they stick out like a sore thumb because all of a sudden the characters have become different people. And never more so than when you start the movie with Harrison Ford snogging Carrie Fisher, whereas she'd ended the first film snogging Mark Hamill.
Well, it's a good thing that she didn't go any further with Mark Hamill, given the revelations about their paternity. But I think the other thing that colours that is that by the time we're seeing Empire Strikes Back, we've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, and we're waiting for Temple of Doom, and suddenly we can't.
No, Raiders is after. Raiders is after Empire. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's 82. Or is it 81?
81. If you're my age and you're watching these films, not necessarily in the order they came out in. Harrison Ford, by that point, there was no Han Solo. There was just the performance Harrison Ford gives in every film all the time. So, is that a fault of the writing of episode 2? No, I think that's a limitation of how we view actors.
And just to push back slightly on the Mark Hamill or the Luke Skywalker Princess Leia kiss, surely that's done from vague memory to make Han Solo jealous. So she kisses Luke Skywalker in front of Han Solo to make a point about, so there's no contradiction. It's not like she's suddenly got the hots for Luke Skywalker. Thank God.
She's not a slapper.
No, she's just doing it to sort of, make a comic statement.
Yeah, we'll just let that one hang in the air there. I mean, Return of the Jedi then is kind of, even at the time, I think was kind of sort of regarded as a bit of a rerun of the first, because all of a sudden you've got the Death Star again, and kind of follows the same plot, starts on a sand planet and ends with, the X-Wings and what have you, going off to destroy the Death Star. And it kind of straddles this sort of uneasy thing between the sort of the Lawrence Kasdan influence with the screwball dialogue and the 40s style characters, and having the sort of excitement stuff from the sort of kiddie space fights and what have you from the first movie, the dogfights, the sort of Battle of Britain dogfights in space. And then he throws in the Ewoks as well. So Return of the Jedi, I'll ask whether it's a satisfying end to the saga afterwards. But first of all, Empire Strikes Back says, right, the kids who were 8 when the first film was out are now 11. So let's make a movie because the difference between being 8 and being 11 is quite significant. So Empire Strikes Back grows up quite a lot. But then Return of the Jedi doesn't subsequently grow up in the same way as Empire Strikes Back does. And actually, Return of the Jedi, the second half of it is very much sort of a military sort of mission movie, sort of as you can imagine in sort of rural Germany or somewhere with a bunch of Americans and Brits coming together to do the mission. It's very much one of those kind of things, really, but with flying bikes in it instead of the kind of motorbike and sidecar that you'd had in these. So he's still doing war movies, George Lucas, at this point, but he's kind of kidified it again by putting the Ewoks in too. So even at the age of now, so I would have been 15 when this came out, it felt like this really weird mishmash, and I could never quite get to grips with Return of the Jedi when I was a kid. So Simon, how was that for you when Return of the Jedi came out?
Oh, I thought it's the most exciting thing ever. I read the novel before I saw the film.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah, the book came out before the film. So I went into school and told everyone what they wanted to know. I only asked,
you were that
very
guy.
good with spoilers even then.
Okay.
I said, do you want to know what happens? And they all said, yes, we do. And I told them.
Stood up at the front of the class on the table, in fact. And...
Yeah. But I've told the story before. It took me 3 attempts to see it all the way through. I mean, I already knew the story, but I just I had panic attacks of it being too intense. And the first time I got halfway through the film, second time I got nearly all the way through the film, and watched the last bit with the reveal of Anakin Skywalker's face on the little window you could see outside the screen as it projected from the projector. And then the third time, my uncle made me sit in the chair and said, "Oh, sit down for God's sake," and made me watch it. And I was all right after that.
He was fed up of spending all his money over and over again.
Yeah, that was the first time he went. Anyway, yeah. So, but it's probably the one that's dulled the most out of the 3 for me in later years. But I still, because it doesn't have the weight, doesn't have the dramatic. Ironically, apart from that, the final scene with Luke and Darth, which is amazing. I don't think it has the dramatic weight of Empire. It feels lighter. It feels slightly more Disney.
Yeah.
And that's not just because of the Ewoks. That's just in general, with all the puppets and everything like that. It seems to play at the comedy quite strongly. considering in theory it should be the most intense of the three.
There's a really weird tonal shift between the stuff in Jabba's palace, which is quite dark in many ways, and then you get to sort of like teddy bears running around the jungle squeaking at each other and throwing, you know, catapults and what have you around. It's a very weird tonal shift in the middle of that movie that I don't think it really quite pulls off. Ian, though, this was then the first one you saw at the pictures.
Yeah.
Can you remember were you excited? Because Star Wars for a lot of people is like and you said it yourself, it's kind of a shibboleth in your life. But clearly when you got to go and see Return of the Jedi, it can't have been that yet. So can you remember what your feelings were about going to see it?
Yeah, it felt like I was kind of processing up the high street to become king or something, you know. It was like, this is the best thing that's ever happened in my young life. And I think, like you guys, I'd read the book already, so I was aware what was going to happen. So I was obviously really obsessed with the story, even though this was one of the first films I'd seen in the cinema. I think before this I'd seen maybe Flash Gordon and Dragon Slayer, and that was probably, this was, you know, potentially my third film. And I was so excited. And as you were saying, you know, it's a game of two halves. You've got this brilliant first 40 minutes on Tatooine again, and then it all just went to hell for me. I was so upset. Even though I knew how it ended, I was so upset. There's no way Vader is losing that fight with Skywalker. No way. And even if he did, there's no way the Emperor's not killing both of them. Sorry, but, you know,
Wow.
Still not over it.
Really, though. Were you really sort of on Darth Vader's side at that age?
I really was. I just thought he was the most iconic thing ever, and he was just the epitome of, like, amazing brilliance. And
that explains Rishi Sunak. It's brilliant.
I'm not sure it explains Rishi Sunak.
It does. He's a Star Wars fan, and you think, how can you be a capitalist and be a Star Wars fan? And that's what it is.
See, for him, the most amazing thing ever was Emperor Palpatine, right?
Yeah, this is it.
He's got none of the gravitas of either of those. At best, he's a low-level moth.
Matt, Return of the Jedi. I'm telly for you then.
I'm just thinking of epitome of amazing brilliance being as a strap line on the poster. Ian Martin weaves spells with his words. Return of the Jedi. I think the Ewoks are maligned. I think their childishness is sort of overstated. I don't really see that much of a change of tone between the two halves. Obviously, there's a change of tone between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I think it's probably appropriate because Empire Strikes Back is a kind of a tragedy, and it's a dark tragedy, and so Return of the Jedi brings a bit more lightness back into it, and it's sort of. But then, as Simon said, that kind of final fight between Skywalker and Darth Vader, the key is that is cut with the Ewoks bit, and it is cut with the space battle bit. So it's got the three things being intercut, and they all kind of balance each other out in kind of tones. You get a real kind of comforting balance of tones. I've watched Return of the Jedi more than any of the three original Star Wars films, and I think it might be my favorite.
Wow.
Just I love the forest. The forest setting is so interesting. I love the speeder bikes, the hover bike things were so. I mean, the toys for those were so cool because they broke on purpose. You just pressed the button and they exploded, and that was incredibly exciting for me.
It was the epitome of excellent brilliance, or whatever I said.
I mean, it was the apogee of amazing.
It was the
amazing excitedness.
It was the apogee of. It was the apogee of Acme.
It was the very. It was the very apex of apogeic brilliance.
Yeah.
And as I said before, the opening scene, yes, it's set in Tatooine, but it does something interesting and different with Tatooine. The Sardak beast was really freaked me out as a kid. They got rid of Boba Fett quite quickly. I see Simon, for the benefits of the the non-camera viewing population, has a speeder bike, which is probably worth quite a lot, I would imagine, because as soon as you press the button to blow it up,
to risk it.
Yeah, here he goes.
Sorry, podcast listeners, I am about to press the button on the back of a speeder bike.
Oh.
Do it.
Yay! So for me, as soon as I did that on my toy, I obviously lost pieces. So I'm assuming that there's countless like speeder bike toys. And yeah, the Ewoks are fine. I got the joke when I was younger. I didn't find them hilariously funny. I just accepted them as another sort of Star Wars icon.
Was it a satisfying end to sort of the trilogy? Because at this point he'd very definitely said this was going to be a trilogy, and then, you know, he talked about, in general terms, there being a prequel trilogy and a sequel trilogy to follow at some point. But this was the end of this story insofar as audiences in the 1980s were concerned. Was it satisfying? Was it a satisfying end to the story, Ian?
Really not for me, and it really is as shallow and pathetic as I don't think Luke Skywalker could have beaten Vader or the Emperor in a fight. Sorry. I know he had to for story reasons.
I think it's as satisfying as it can get, but I think the bit that it took Simon 17 times to get through, which is the unmasking of Vader, I think that was for me the climax, because that's the kind of, it's not the moment where, I don't know, there's a moral climax where he kind of switches sides and picks up the Emperor and throws him down the trash can. But when he takes his mask off, that's when Vader really dies, because he becomes Sebastian Shaw and a kindly sort of squidgy Royal Shakespeare Company actor underneath.
Those Healy eyebrows that they later CGI'd out. Yeah.
But somehow that works. That works for me, because somehow that stops him being that sort of visually tells you he's not Darth Vader anymore. He's now Anakin Skywalker.
He's been turned back into a human being. He's spent the rest of the movies as a cyborg, and now he's returned to his humanity. And of course, as we all know, when you get returned to your humanity, that's the end of your story and you expire. Yeah. That's how storytelling works.
So yeah, the Death Star blowing up again, that's fine. The Ewoks having their dance.
Point,
I think it's a better conclusion than the special edition turned it into, with the multiple shots across all of George Lucas's CGI created planets with not as good a music on it. I preferred the music on Return of the Jedi.
But on that point, with the destruction of the Death Star at the end, I think Return of the Jedi finishes a trilogy that has become a sort of expanded version of just the story from the first movie. So the first movie, you start on Tatooine and you've got a story that happens on Tatooine, and then you've got a bridging bit on the Death Star in the middle, which kind of has a sort of tragic ending. Which kind of has a tragic ending, which leads into the big battle for everybody's survival and the destruction of the Death Star at the end. And if you look at it, Star Wars, the movie, A New Hope, Episode 4, whatever you want to call it, is basically the Tatooine bit. Empire Strikes Back is the Death Star bit. Return of the Jedi is, the big battle at the end. It ends in the same way as Star Wars ends, because basically what George Lucas has done is taken the first film and stretched it. So I don't think he's really sort of, clearly it's gone into new areas, but I don't think he's expanded it by changing things. I think he's expanded it by enlarging things. But
in a way, that's a kind of a failing in the first film, that George Lucas shoots his load too early. By basically, well, if you think about it, this is one of the problems with the sequel, the second, the J.J. Abrams trilogy, in that they try and up. I mean, the Death Star is such a massive weapon that they try to up it by having an even bigger Death Star planet type thing, and it doesn't. And then they try to up it again by having this weird Emperor's fleet behind a curtain somewhere, and it never quite works because the Death Star is the biggest thing you can imagine. And so you're right that in the first film he's basically told his whole story. It's exactly, so successful, he wants to tell more, but that's not the fault of the sequels trying to sort of they successfully eke out more texture and more emotion and character and backstory out of the idea.
But I think the two things that happen is, yes, he's finished the story in the first film and it can't go anywhere. And I think the only way to make more Star Wars is to keep returning to that trough, which is what they do. And I think that is kind of a problem. I don't think it's a problem of the first film. The first film is this perfect self-contained film. It's the problem of trying to take a perfect self-contained film and make more of it. And like Simon says, and I've not seen it yet, so I can't say for certain, but it sounds like with something like Andor, what they've done or what they've been doing with these TV series is finding ways to do Star Wars where it doesn't maybe hopefully feel quite as repetitive as the movies had done. But yeah, I think it's there. Star Wars is this perfect self-contained movie. And to get more Star Wars, you just have to keep repeating bits of Star Wars. So I don't see the complaint when Force Awakens comes out that they've gone back and done another Death Star, because Return of the Jedi had already done another Death Star. And essentially, that's what you do with Star Wars. You repeat Star Wars to do more Star Wars. So I don't think it's a fault of the other movies that they're carrying on repeating those same things. I think Star Wars is essentially that story. And you just have to try and find enough variety in your settings and your characters.
I mean, there's an irony, I think, that out of these three trilogies, only one of the three trilogies is actually clearly designed as a trilogy, and that's the prequel one.
Yeah.
The sequels, the sequel, the third trilogy, should have been designed as a trilogy.
Yeah.
But, and again, the last Jedi, the Ryan, the middle one, that's my favorite of the three. But it's absolutely true that it kind of like it clearly sort of tries to drag it in a different direction, and then the failing is not to carry on in that direction. They just drag it back into sort of the nostalgia. But at least the prequels are clearly written and designed because they know they're going to get all three. They're one person. But they're just not very good.
Yeah. Well, I'm so busting for a week. I'm going to stop this conversation now. I think we've done it quite enough. But before
interesting, we could get like a lightsaber effect going on in the video.
But before I ask us to score the three movies, because that's what we do, Simon, I can't remember if I did ask you if it was a satisfying end. Jedi.
I think it was. I mean, it had to be, because that was the end for how many years before the Timothy Zahn books came out. I mean, I used to read the comic, but the comics never convinced me that these were proper, canon stories of Star Wars, because they did stupid things with C-3PO being able to jump around all over the place like he did in Attack of the Clones. But
I remember between Star Wars and Empire, I read Splinter of a Mind's Eye, and I could never quite reconcile the sort of expansion of the universe.
Yeah, Timothy Zahn books are great. They felt like Star Wars.
Should we spend 40 minutes just very carefully talking about the extended universe? Is that worth doing?
Yeah.
And if
we'll be writing the Journal of the Wheels in a minute.
Quite slowly. Splinter of the Mind's Eye I bought the other day. I bought a few months ago. That's the sequel that they wrote without knowing what the sequel is going to be. He just makes up a sequel for.
It's the very first expanded universe book, and it comes out, I think, in 1978. It was quite soon after.
Yes.
Didn't they write it with a view to it being the next film?
Initially? No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
I thought there was that story. Oh, maybe that was just.
Might be, but it sounds to me like Apocrypha, because I remember when it came out, my feeling about it was George Lucas had already said there were going to be 3 films. And in between each of the 3 films, there were going to be 3 books to bridge the gaps. So there was going to be one in 78 and one at the start of 79 and one at the end of 79. And then the next movie would be Summer of 80. And unless I'm completely misremembering, that's what I was expecting to happen. And I wasn't interested enough in Splinter of Mind's Eye to keep an eye on whether the books came out as they were supposed to, and whether that's actually what happened.
Splinter of a Mind's Eye? Just
Alan Dean Foster.
Yeah, it's an Alan Dean Foster.
Who I think, didn't he ghostwrite the first novel?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, did people gush over it when it was released? Like
It
waterfalls dripping slowly onto a stone base.
It was a big success. It was very heavily pushed because it was the first Star Wars expanded universe thing. Ian's loving this.
I mean, presumably they could just take it now with Netflix. They could just stream it now.
Would it be a big heavy stream though, or would it be streamed?
I mean, it would be streamed. It would sort of be trickled out over a few years.
Right.
Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie. Every frame of celluloid is indelibly etched upon my brain. It's a 10 out of 10 for me. I know it's got imperfections, but it's a 10 out of 10. Matt.
Oh, but Simon's looking at me. 7 out of 10. Knowing where my other scores are going to go.
Fair enough.
But that's. I mean, it is an extraordinary film. It's a groundbreaking. Like, it changed the face of cinema. I just can't watch it all the way through without getting bored.
Simon.
9.
Wow.
Oh,
I think it's a 9.
Ian.
I do love it, but you know me, I love my 8 films, and I sometimes think some 8 out of 10 films are better than 10 out of 10 films.
So I'm putting you down for an 8 then.
No, 9.
Oh, 8 for Empire. We'll get there. Ian, Star Wars.
I'm gonna go 9 as well, but I don't know why.
Well, I'm shocked. Empire Strikes Back then. Ian.
A different 9, but still a 9.
Right, I'm going to draw that upside down because it's still a 9, but it's actually a 6. Simon.
I think it's a 9. I think it's 9, and I take your point that it doesn't. I don't think you've said it this episode, but you said it on the last time we talked about it, that it kind of nothing much happens. But equally, if you think of it as part 2 of a 3-part story, then that's fine. And at the end of the day, we're just happy spending time in the Star Wars universe. So, but it's a 9, please.
And I'm going to give it an 8 because I still think it's a terrific movie, obviously, but I just don't think it's up to the standard of Star Wars, frankly, not for me. And Matt?
8.
So you're going lower than either Simon or Ian too.
Am I?
Right.
Sorry, I wasn't listening to other people. No, it's higher. It's better than Star Wars for me.
Okay, no, I'll come back to you for Return of the Jedi then. But for me, Return of the Jedi is a 7 because as much as I love a lot of it, there are bits of it that really irritate me. Ian.
7 as well. Starts really well, but there's no way that Luke is. It's just not going to happen. He's not winning that fight.
I mean, in a pissing contest.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Simon, Return of the Jedi.
They're squeezing out every drop of that joke.
Yeah.
Return of the Jedi has got to be an 8, I think.
Fair enough. And Matt.
8. But slightly better than Empire Strikes Back. But I would happily watch both of those films, one after the other, and I very may well do this Christmas.
Fair enough. Right, I guess we'll come back sometime next year and talk about the prequel trilogy. Until then, I am JR, dashing off to the toilet.
I was Matt.
I'm Ian, and I'm going for a cream bun.
And I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.